Grace to you and peace in the name of Jesus Christ. Hi friends down at Myers Park Baptist Church. I want to say thank you for inviting me to share this morning's sermon. Some of you may know that I am a native North Carolinian. I grew up about 90 minutes northwest of Charlotte, up in the foothills of North Carolina, and so today feels a bit like a homecoming, if only virtually. I also want to say thanks to another North Carolinian, a young woman whose name is Sophie, and Sophie's dad was a seminary classmate of mine. When Sophie heard about my story, she wrote this lovely, encouraging note to me and sent it along with these lovely earrings, which, as you can see, have beads that match the colors of the transgender pride flag. So I wanted to wear those today and say again, thanks, Sophie, and thanks to all of you. On an unknown evening, sometime in August of 1966, 54 years ago this month, a woman was having a cup of coffee at an all-night restaurant. That restaurant has long since been demolished, but in those days it stood at the corner of Turk Street and Taylor in San Francisco, California. Now, history is a bit hazy as to what happened on that evening in that all-night restaurant, but in all likelihood, the woman with the cup of coffee got herself arrested for what she was wearing. Now, that particular part of the story may sound strange to you. You might be asking yourself, what on earth would a woman have had to be wearing in a countercultural hotspot like San Francisco in the 1960s to get herself arrested? And well, we don't know for sure. We don't know too many details about that night, but I think I have a pretty good idea about the outfit that she would have been wearing. My guess is she was wearing a button-up shirt dress with a nice A-line silhouette, maybe a neat blouse with a skirt, and probably a shiny pair of classic pumps, perhaps something like kitten heels. So why did this woman get herself arrested? Well, chances are it was because the woman with the coffee was a transgender woman. And chances are the arresting officer wanted to book her for violating ordinances against cross-dressing. That kind of thing happened all the time back then. Felicia Flames, a local woman who remembers what those days of police harassment were like, says, "We were thrown in jail for obstructing the sidewalk. We were thrown in jail for dressing like a woman, because in those days it was illegal. Anything they could do to make their quota or just to make our lives a living hell," she said. That's what they would do. Well, it was on that unknown night, sometime in the middle of August of 1966, that woman, whose name is lost to history, decided that she had waited way too long to freely be herself. She had waited too long to live a peaceful existence. She had waited too long for a chance just to sit at a table in a restaurant with a cup of coffee without getting harassed by police. And so it was 3 full years before either Marcia or Sylvia or maybe Stormy threw the first brick at Stonewall. A fierce but forgotten transgender woman threw her cup of coffee in the face of the officer who was trying to arrest her simply for claiming her place in the world. So began the Compton's cafeteria riots, one of the earliest acts of LGBTQ+ resistance against police brutality. "We were tired," said one woman, remembering those riots. "We were tired of being arrested for nothing. We were tired of being arrested for being who we wanted to be." More than half a century's passed. The struggle that erupted on that unknown evening of August 1966, the struggle that erupted later in the more prominent Stonewall riots, is a struggle that has continued in the decades since. And although our world has seen a lot of progress, I know that LGBTQ+ people, especially trans women of color, are still often the victims of harassment. They're still on the receiving end of bigoted hatred and violence. They're still subjected to cruelty and discrimination simply because of who they are. Just yesterday, I saw a news article that told of 2 transgender women taken into police custody at a Black Lives Matter demonstration in Miami, Florida. And in talking about the way that they were disrespected and dehumanized while they were in custody, those trans women described treatment that is sadly similar to what was happening over 50 years ago at the time of the Compton's cafeteria riots. There was a civil rights advocate quoted in the article who said, "Too often, transgender people of color and transgender women in general are disproportionately subjected to harassment and discrimination when dealing with authorities." And it's not just with the police. Trans women often fear and deal with harassment and discrimination wherever they are, whoever they're dealing with. So many of us are still tired, folks. Tired of struggling for acceptance, tired of being pressured to debate our very existence, tired of waiting for the rest of the world to see our humanity. Hope delayed makes the heart sick, reads Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12. But longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Too many LGBTQ plus people and too many marginalized people of all genders and orientations are heart sick over delayed hopes. Too many of us are tired, waiting for our turn to eat that fruit from what Proverbs calls the tree of life. And speaking of waiting for a turn and speaking of eating, Dr. Kane read to us a few moments ago about a passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. Now, one of the interesting things that this passage offers us is something like a story within a story. Jesus and his disciples are having a conversation about bread. And it's a conversation in which the disciples, who are rarely ones to get the picture easily, are lost in one of Jesus's metaphors. And so it is, a warning against Pharisaic narrowness becomes a conversation about bread, literal bread. Now that's when Jesus calls their attention back to a pair of miraculous events in their recent past. He invites them to remember the time when he fed a crowd of 5,000 people with 12 baskets of food left over. You can find that story in Mark chapter 6. And then Jesus invites the disciples to remember the time he fed another crowd, this time 4,000 people, this time with enough food left over to fill 7 baskets. Now that story shows up a couple of verses before today's reading from Mark chapter 8. Now, folks studying Mark's gospel like to point out that one of the big differences between the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6 and the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark chapter 8 is location. When Jesus feeds the first multitude, he is in his home territory. He is in Jewish territory. He is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, by the time Jesus feeds that second multitude, he and his disciples have gotten into the boat and sailed to the eastern side of the sea. That is not Jewish territory. So the word here is that Jew and Gentile, west of the border and east of the border, insiders and outcasts, everybody gets fed. There's enough for all. Now in Mark, we learn this lesson in the space of 3 chapters. The time it takes us to get from a blessing that is for some people to a blessing that is for all people is relatively short. And somewhere in that relatively short space between those 2 stories, there's another story that stands out to me. Now, it's a story about a Gentile woman, a woman that Mark says is Syrophoenician, who comes to Jesus in utter distress over her sick daughter. This woman, the gospel tells us, is not warmly met by Jesus and his disciples. She received what amounts to rejection, multiple rejections, in fact. Readers of her story have struggled for centuries with what seems to be a cold response from Jesus. But this woman, like so many marginalized people across history, like the similarly unnamed woman at Compton's cafeteria, just could not keep waiting. So she was so tired of waiting, and she kept pushing and pushing, and Jesus, impressed as much by the woman's words as her faith, gave her what she wanted. Now, there's a particular line spoken by Jesus in the middle of that story about the Syrophoenician woman, It's a line that ties readers of the Gospels up into knots because they don't know what to make of it. It really doesn't sound like the Jesus that we claim to know. It's not right, Jesus says, in response to the woman's pleas for mercy, to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs. In other words, and Matthew makes it a little clearer in his telling of the same story, Jesus says, "My work is with my own people, not Gentiles." Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do with that line, except perhaps to say that if it bothers you, maybe that's a good thing. Let it bother you. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but I am quite sure that these are not the words of someone who is about to give literal bread to several thousand Gentiles. And yet, when the time comes, when the crowd of Gentiles is gathered and when they are hungry, there is mercifully, miraculously enough for all. There's bread for the outcasts just as surely as there was bread for the insiders. Now perhaps, friends, this reality, this blessed state of things, comes to be, at least in part, because of an unnamed woman who was tired of waiting, tired of being seen, tired of being treated as an outsider, tired of putting up with all those who believed she was less than deserving, less than worthy, less than human, tired of being made to feel like she was a poorer version of God's image than the privileged folks who kept pushing her out on the margins. So many of us are tired of waiting. So many of our siblings are tired of wondering when our world will look more like the holy dream that Jesus gives us glimpses of, more like a world where there is enough for all. More like the world that Isaiah the prophet foresaw long ago when they spoke of a time when foreigners and eunuchs and all manner of outcasts will be gathered in the joyful and peaceful house of the divine. So many of us are tired of hearing the same type of excuses Dr. Martin Luther King heard during the Civil Rights Movement. People said to him, "These things take time. Why did you have to move forward in such an untimely way? Why couldn't you have given racist leaders more time to have a dialogue, more time to debate about whether or not they might consider at some point being less racist? Why did you keep going? Why didn't you keep waiting?" Dr. King said that pretty much every movement, every action, everything he ever did was written off by critics as untimely. Now, too often, those exact same words, those same excuses have been offered to LGBTQ people who have the audacity to expect dignity and agency and humanity for themselves. It's too untimely. You're going to have to wait for it. It's kind of a mantra in the moderate religious world. Especially I have experienced and discovered in the moderate Baptist world, saying, you're going to have to wait on that one. I've been hearing that excuse or some variation of that excuse for the better part of 20 years now. I heard it back when I was in seminary, when our student life director was forced to resign after refusing to out LGBTQ students to the administration. In those days, long before I accepted and embraced my authentic gender identity, I just thought of myself as a somewhat dedicated but inexperienced ally. And I wanted an answer as to why a beloved member of our community had been pushed out. The answer I got from leadership was, well, if we advocate for the acceptance of LGBTQ people, we're going to undo all the work that we've done for women in ministry. To this day, I think that must have been the most on-brand thing I've ever heard a moderate Baptist leader say. I'm sad to confess that it was an answer that made a lot of sense to me back in those days. But really, the answer was, you're just going to have to wait. How often, I wonder, has that excuse been accompanied by the tactic of pitting one marginalized group against another? You're going to have to wait. And listen, we can only do one item at a time on the social justice to-do list. It's not your turn. You have to wait. Listen, June, at least when you were fired by your church for being a transgender woman, at least when that happened, you got 48% of the vote. Think of how that might have gone in a Baptist church 10 years ago. Think about how it might go 10 years from now. Now, I don't want to disregard the fact that progress is being made. I don't want to discourage those who are deeply committed to the struggle for equality, but the message, even in a 52-48 vote, is still, you're just going to have to wait. We're almost there. There's almost enough space for all. We will get there, probably, at some undetermined point in the future. Maybe we'll arrive someday in a world where the acceptance of our LGBTQ plus siblings is not a subject of debate anymore. Maybe we'll come to the place where subjecting a leader who comes out as transgender is itself seen as an act of prejudice. But we're not there yet. Not yet. You're going to have to wait. Wait till the next generation. Wait until after the next election. Wait until the next legislative session. Wait until we've passed this other law. Wait until we've made enough space for this other marginalized population. Wait until we've had a chance to engage in sufficient dialogue, until we feel like we've gotten a grasp of this situation. Wait until we can engage in the issue in a more civil tone. Wait until things settle down. Wait until the world turns another time or two, or 10, or 50. Wait. Back when LGBTQ plus advocate Sarah McBride was lobbying lawmakers in her native Delaware to pass a bill protecting LGBTQ plus people from discrimination, she got a lot of people telling her that she needed to wait. She has written about her experience trying to make the world a better, more inclusive place for her transgender siblings. And she writes that as the legislation she supported moved further and further towards passage, there were some people who began to push for the exclusion of trans people from that bill. You know, we can focus on protecting gay, lesbian, bisexual people. This session, they reasoned, almost sounding like good allies. We think our voters are ready for that, but what they're not ready for are laws protecting people from discrimination on the basis of gender identity. Incidentally, transgender people have been listening to that same reasoning, and they've been on the losing end of that same debate ever since the 1960s. Sarah and other trans advocates were admonished for trying to move too quickly. They were told to wait. But she wouldn't take no. She wouldn't take wait for an answer. Listen to what she writes about her experience. Each time we ask anyone, whether they're transgender, black, an immigrant, Muslim, Native American, gay, or a woman, to sit by and let an extended conversation take place about whether they deserve to be respected and affirmed in who they are, we are asking people to watch their one life pass by without dignity and fairness. And that is too much to ask of anyone. It's Pride Month in Charlotte, more than 50 years after the modern beginnings of the push for LGBTQ plus liberation. And even today, so many people are still tired. So many people are being asked to wait, to watch their one life pass by without dignity or fairness. So many people are heartsick from hope delayed. So many are longing for the time when God's dream for creation is fulfilled, when outcasts are gathered at the table just like they would have been back at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco. So many are joining protests and throwing bricks and cups of coffee, and like the Syrophoenician woman, they're refusing to take no for an answer. So many are waiting, hungry, on the other side of the lake, waiting for decent, moderate church folks to start living like faithful disciples of the one who came to show us all that there is enough bread for all, space enough for all, grace enough for all, love enough for all. Amen.